So in 1919, the smartest geologists on Earth looked at all the available data and declared that the United States would run out of oil in exactly 11 years.
Right, by 1930.
Yeah, by 1930, the tanks would be completely dry, the whole industry would collapse, and the world would basically grind to a halt. And, well, they were off by about a century.
And it's wild because that wasn't some, fringe theory or anything. That was the United States Geological Survey saying that.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is really to cut through the massive amount of noise surrounding the future of global energy. We've tailored this conversation specifically for you.
Yeah, whether you're an engineer mapping out structural loads, or maybe a student studying marine logistics, or honestly just someone who wants an academic but totally accessible look at how resource exploration actually works.
Because when you step into the world of global energy, all those precise, mathematical models of engineering suddenly get thrown into this blender of unpredictable human behavior and geopolitical friction.
It really does. And we are pulling our insights today from a really extensive, fascinating interview with Professor Wasik Janicki. He's a political geographer, and he specializes in unpacking these historical fears and then contrasting them with modern realities, especially when we're talking about the extraction and management of global resources.
And if you've ever looked at a failed prediction from 1919 and wondered how the data could be that wrong, well, the truth is the data actually wasn't wrong. Their imagination was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everything you think you know about peak oil is fundamentally misunderstood.
Yeah.
And later on, we'll get into how one major nation essentially solved the alternative fuel puzzle.
Oh, the Brazil case study. It's so good.
It's incredible. They've been running cars on cheap organic matter for decades.
Mm-hmm.
But as any systems engineer listening knows, every single solution introduces a new bottleneck. And this one comes with a hidden cost that could honestly destabilize the globe.
It really is a brilliant case study in how solving a highly localized energy problem can just create a catastrophic vulnerability in a completely different global system.
Right. But okay, before we talk about what replaces oil, we kind of have to look at the physical resource itself. Mm-hmm. Because for decades, the dominant narrative has been that we are, squeezing the last drops out of the earth.
Right, the whole fear of running out.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
If you want to really understand why this fear persists, think of oil exploration, like searching this massive pitch black warehouse with just a tiny pen light. Just because your beam doesn't hit a box doesn't mean the warehouse is empty.
Right. It just means you need a better flashlight.
Exactly.
And honestly, the history of the oil industry is basically just the history of us inventing better flashlights. I mean, the fear of scarcity is almost as old as commercial drilling itself.
Wait, really? How far back does it go?
Well, the very first commercial oil well in the US was drilled in 1859. And by the late 1860s, so literally just 10 years later, panic was already setting in that the earth was running dry.
10 years. That's insane. They barely even had a commercial market for combustion engines yet, and they were already terrified the tank was hitting empty.
Yeah, exactly. So why do highly educated, data-driven experts continually get this so wrong? Well, Professor Janicki breaks this down into three core mechanisms.
Right, and the first one goes right back to that warehouse analogy we just talked about, which is a profound lack of imagination regarding future extraction technologies.
Yeah. In 1919, the USGS just couldn't conceive of modern marine engineering. They were essentially measuring the future using the limitations of the present.
Because we aren't just getting a bigger pen light anymore. We invented seismic 3D imaging.
Right, where we send acoustic waves deep into the Earth's crust.
Yeah, and then record the reflections to build these insane high-resolution models of geological structures that are thousands of meters below the ocean floor. We literally went from guessing where oil might pool to using algorithmic modeling to see straight through the rock.
And the experts in 1919 just couldn't predict things like deep water offshore drilling platforms or, horizontal drilling where a bit goes down 2 miles and then just turns 90 degrees to snake through a specific layer of shale.
They just assumed the easy to reach stuff was all there was.
Exactly. But the second reason these predictions fail is actually biological.
This part blew my mind.
Right. As humans, we have this hardwired neurobiological tendency to over-index on negative news. Recognizing a threat like running out of resources is what keeps you alive in the wilderness.
So our amygdala just latches onto the fear of scarcity way more strongly than the promise of abundance.
Exactly. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism, but it makes us terrible at evaluating long-term resource data.
It totally skews the math. And then you combine that biological blind spot with the third reason. the institutional and economic realities.
Right. Academic and scientific structures dictate that researchers, well, they often secure significantly more funding when they sound the alarm about a looming crisis.
Yeah, I mean, if a geologist writes a grant proposal saying, hey, the energy supply is stable and totally abundant, the funding just dries up.
There's no urgency.
Exactly. But if they argue that society is on the brink of an energy collapse and they need a multi-million-dollar grant to study the impact, well, suddenly the capital flows.
It's a structural bias in how we investigate the world. Fear gets funded.
Fear gets funded. I love that phrasing. So if we strip away the biological panic and that institutional bias, the reality is we aren't running out of oil. We are still actively discovering it.
Very actively.
But finding a massive new oil basin isn't just an engineering triumph. The moment the drills hit pay dirt, it introduces massive geopolitical risks. Feeding oil seems like winning the lottery, but how does that actually play out on the global stage?
What's fascinating here is the internal dynamics of OPEC. You know, the organization controlling a massive portion of the global oil market. Inside OPEC, a member country's export quota, like the actual volume of oil they are legally permitted to sell on the global market, is directly tied to the size of its declared reserves.
Okay, wait. So if a country declares they've just discovered, say, another billion barrels in the ground, OPEC allows them to pump and sell a higher volume of oil today.
Yes, that's a crucial mechanical detail of the organization.
But who actually audits those discoveries? Are there independent geologists flying out to verify every single barrel a nation claims to have found?
And that is the structural flaw. The system heavily relies on self-reporting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this creates a massive systemic incentive for member states to constantly declare that they have more oil, never less, because the bigger your declared reserves, the bigger your immediate slice of the economic pie.
That makes total sense. And that dynamic drives constant, highly aggressive exploration, right?
Exactly. It's pushing engineers into some of the most unforgiving marine environments on the planet just to back up those claims or, find the next massive deposit.
And the environments they are pushing into require staggering feats of engineering. The source highlights recent massive discoveries like the Santos Basin off the coast of Brazil, the Kazagan Field in the Caspian Sea, and the Essequibo Basin in Guyana.
Yeah, and if you are an engineer, the Santos Basin is just a mind-bending challenge. We're talking about the pre-salt layer.
Right, so you have an offshore rig floating in over 2,000 meters of ocean water.
Just to start.
Just to start. Then the drill has to penetrate another 2,000 to 3,000 meters of rock, sand, and then, this is the crazy part, a massive layer of solid salt.
And drilling through salt is basically a nightmare scenario for mechanical engineers because under extreme pressure and temperature, salt behaves less like a solid rock and more like a highly viscous, creeping plastic.
It actually flows.
Yes, it flows. It can literally crush the steel drill casing as you are trying to bore through it. The fluid dynamics and material sciences required to just keep a well bore open in those conditions are monumental.
It's incredible. And then you have the Kazagan Field, which faces a completely different environmental extreme because the Caspian Sea actually freezes.
Right, so you can't just anchor a standard floating rig out there.
Because the shifting sea ice would literally shear the legs right off the platform.
Exactly, so they had to construct massive artificial islands out of rock just to house the drilling equipment and to protect it from the crushing force of the winter ice.
So these aren't just guys out there with pickaxes. These are multi-billion-dollar, highly pressurized extraction factories operating in conditions that actively want to destroy them.
Totally. But the source points out that overcoming the physical engineering challenges is often the easy part. The real danger comes after the oil is secured.
Right. What happens when a small country suddenly hits the jackpot next to a struggling giant? Like when Guyana discovered those huge marine reserves in the Essequibo Basin, it instantly triggered geopolitical conflict.
Yeah. Neighboring Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, but is unfortunately suffering from a devastating economic collapse where citizens are fleeing starvation.
And when Guyana struck oil, Venezuela suddenly threatened to invade, citing this centuries-old border treaty to claim the territory. And just to be clear, we are reporting this strictly as an objective geopolitical reality detailed in the source material. We aren't taking sides here.
Exactly. It just perfectly illustrates how geological data instantly shifts military and political fault lines. A massive resource discovery can be an economic miracle, but it's also a target painted on a nation's back.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword. But on the flip side, the reward if managed with extreme discipline, is staggering. Take Norway as a textbook example.
Right, of macroeconomic engineering.
Yeah, they discovered massive offshore marine oil reserves in the early 1970s. And today, oil and gas constitute over 50% of Norway's total export economy.
But they structured an entirely different financial destiny than most resource-rich nations. Instead of injecting all that capital directly into the daily economy, which, often causes runaway inflation and hollows out other industries, they funnel the surplus revenues from their oil extraction into a massive sovereign wealth fund.
Right. They are essentially engineering their financial future, ensuring their citizens have this robust economic safety net that will generate returns for generations after the oil era inevitably ends.
Which perfectly pivots us to the next massive question.
Right. Knowing that oil isn't actually running out anytime soon, but that it brings all this intense geopolitical baggage, border disputes, extreme extraction costs, economic volatility, how does the world actually transition away from it?
Well, there is a brilliant quote in the source from a former Saudi minister of oil. He said, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones."
I love that quote.
It's so good. The Stone Age ended because human beings engineered a better material. We invented bronze. The transition wasn't driven by scarcity, it was driven by innovation.
So the oil age won't end because the wells run dry. It will end because we develop an energy system that is fundamentally superior, cheaper, or more efficient.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We don't necessarily have to look to some sci-fi future of cold fusion to see what that transition might look like. We can look at Brazil as a real-world laboratory. If you're an engineer, think about the ultimate hack. Taking a highly complex proprietary machine and modifying the entire national supply chain so that machine runs on whatever you happen to have growing in your backyard.
Which is essentially what Brazil did to their transportation infrastructure starting in the 1980s. It's one of the most remarkable alternative fuel experiments in modern history.
So what actually happened?
Well, following the massive global oil price shocks of the 1970s, the Brazilian government faced a dangerous vulnerability. They had a rapidly growing population, an expanding industrial base, and a severe reliance on imported foreign oil. So rather than simply exploring for more domestic oil to bridge the gap, they mandated a sweeping systemic engineering change. They required the auto industry to design engines capable of running on 100% organic fuel.
We are talking about fuels designated as B100 or E100. That means 100% biodiesel or 100% ethanol.
Yeah, this isn't the 5 or 10% ethanol blend you might see at your local gas station in the US, which is basically just a slight additive to standard gasoline.
Right, this is pure sugarcane alcohol or pure vegetable oil.
And while you could theoretically run an old mechanical diesel engine on used fry oil from a restaurant, and historically people certainly have, the modern Brazilian solution requires highly sophisticated mechanical engineering.
Because you can't just pour pure alcohol into a standard combustion engine and expect it to run efficiently, right?
No, not at all. Ethanol has a completely different energy density than gasoline. It has a different flash point, and it's highly corrosive to standard rubber seals and fuel lines.
So they engineered flexible fuel engines. And the core of that technology revolves around managing the stoichiometric ratio.
Right. And for those brushing up on their thermodynamics, the stoichiometric ratio is the exact perfect chemical balance of air and fuel needed for a clean, complete combustion cycle.
And because gasoline and alcohol require completely different ratios of oxygen to burn, the engines had to be fundamentally redesigned.
Exactly. The manufacturers integrated advanced sensors directly into the exhaust loop to measure oxygen levels in real time.
And those sensors communicate instantly with the engine control unit.
Right. So whether you pump pure gasoline, pure sugarcane alcohol, or a completely random mix of the two into the tank, the computer detects the chemical composition and adjusts the spark timing and fuel injection duration in milliseconds.
Just to maintain that perfect stoichiometric balance. That is a beautiful piece of adaptable engineering. But what really makes it a global case study is the economics of it all.
Yeah, the cost is the crazy part.
Professor Janicki, who's a Polish academic, contextualizes the cost in the source material using his local currency. He notes that producing a liter of this sugarcane alcohol costs around 50 Polish groszy.
Which, translated into broader terms, we are talking about pennies per liter. It is staggeringly cheap to produce at scale.
Right. It achieves multiple systemic goals simultaneously. It radically insulates the Brazilian economy from global oil price shocks. It provides cheap, predictable energy to a growing workforce, and it significantly lowers carbon emissions.
They literally took agricultural output and transformed it into energy independence.
So as someone looking at this from a pure logistics and engineering standpoint, I have to ask, if this model is so incredibly cheap, if it solves the geopolitical nightmare of oil reliance and the engine mechanics are already completely figured out,
Right.
why hasn't the entire world adopted it?
It's the big question.
Right. Why aren't we running heavy transport and supply chains across the globe on cheap sugarcane alcohol?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture and look at the entire global system, we hit a hard, unyielding physical limit. It's really easy to assume the barrier is just oil industry lobbying holding back progress.
Which, I mean, obviously exists.
Of course it exists. But the true, insurmountable barrier is a fundamental constraint of the planet's surface. As Professor Janicki bluntly puts it in the source material, the Earth is not made of rubber.
You can't just stretch the surface area to fit the needs of both the energy grid and the food supply. But wait, surely we have massive tracts of empty land. Couldn't we just plant these biofuel crops in the desert or on barren, unused terrain?
The problem is the difference between total land and arable land. To create biofuels on the industrial scale required to replace millions of barrels of oil a day, whether you are extracting ethanol from sugarcane, corn, or soy, you require incredibly fertile, water-rich, arable soil.
The exact same soil required to grow crops for human consumption.
Exactly. Every single acre you dedicate to growing industrial fuel for cars and trucks is an acre actively taken away from growing food for humans or livestock.
So what does this all mean? It's a direct zero-sum game between the gas tank and the dinner plate. Let's bring this down to the everyday reality for you, the listener.
Yeah, the economic impact is vastly different depending on where you are.
Right. If you are living in a wealthy, highly developed nation, let's say Switzerland or Norway, food makes up roughly 10 to 15% of your average household budget.
So if a massive global shift toward biofuels limits agricultural output and causes a sudden spike in global grain and crop prices, your grocery bill goes up.
It's annoying. Maybe you adjust your discretionary spending, but your fundamental survival isn't really threatened.
Right. The global economy, however, does not consist solely of highly developed nations with massive disposable incomes. The source highlights countries like Niger, Chad, or Ethiopia.
And in those developing economies, a vast portion of the population spends between 40 to 60% of their total daily income just to feed themselves.
So a sudden global spike in food prices, driven by wealthy nations filling their transit fleets with corn and sugarcane.
It doesn't mean tightening a household budget for those populations. It means outright starvation.
Exactly. When the economic demand for arable land shifts from human sustenance to industrial fuel, the poorest nations just get priced out of survival.
Because the agricultural market will always pivot to the highest bidder.
Right. If a farmer can make significantly more money selling their corn to an ethanol refinery in Europe rather than a food market in Africa, the food simply disappears.